right. So how did I lose 80 pounds and still counting um, in less than 2 years? Um, I'm going to tell you, but not all at once because it'd be far too long a video. So I am going to divide it up into parts. And in part one, I figured before I get to what I did to to lose the weight, first I kind of have to tell you how I gained the weight in the first place. So I figured a little bit about my diet and lifestyle history would be a good thing. So that's what part one's going to be. Um, because, people talk about like, they use the phrase the standard American diet. Um, and, that really is, I understand what people mean by that, but, if you know anything about me, I hate the stereotypes with, where you lump everybody into doing the same thing. And the truth is there's 300 million whatever Americans, and there's a lot of different habits. There's plenty of people that have lived all their life in America that eat healthy stuff and are not obese, and um, you know junk food's not their primary food group. um, so for me it was, though, in a lot of periods of my life, not all of my life, but when I was a little kid and still living with both my parents. I lived with both my parents till I was 13. So in my childhood, um, basically the way I grew up was like a lot of Americans grow up with parents that cook um, dinner on a regular basis and provide breakfast food. Most weekdays it was cereal, and weekends sometimes my dad would cook stuff like pancakes or bacon and eggs or things like that. Um, my mom did most of the cooking dinners. She wasn't big on cooking breakfast. So yeah, if that happened, it was usually my dad that did. But the typical thing for dinners was that every meal would involve some sort of meat, at least one vegetable, and usually some sort of starch item. So like rice or noodles or bread or something like that. And the meat varied a bit, though. Ground beef was definitely very common. Ground beef and chicken were probably the two most common, though we did do other things. And there were some, less, uh, I don't know, less healthy or just more processed stuff that we did have for dinner sometimes when my parents were pressed for time and not cooking. So uh, we would have sometimes things like breaded fish sticks or that sort of thing, hot dogs sometimes. So, and yeah, even ramen, and not the fresh kind of ramen, but the dried stuff in a package. So yeah, full of MSG and all kinds of other great stuff. Um, yeah, so that was, and school lunches were obviously very similar in the sense that the school set, was like, we provide a balanced meal, balanced meaning that there was some sort of meat, some sort of starch, some sort of vegetable, and milk to drink. And they also had ice cream, for that all important dessert group. So that was like basically how I grew up. And of course, when I would go to somebody else's house, then there'd be a little variety in that, in terms of, some of my acquaintances growing up were similar to my family in that they would cook meals, when they had guests. And others were like, you can dig whatever you can find out of the fridge kind of thing, or elsewhere. Uh, And of course, once we got a microwave, I don't remember exactly what year that was or what part of my childhood, but for you kids listening, there was a time when not everybody had a microwave. There still are people in the world that don't have microwaves, but it's very common, obviously, in America, for people to just talk about popping something in the microwave. And I don't remember exactly how much of my childhood it was before we had a microwave, but once we had that, obviously, it made it even easier to, you know, heat up things, leftovers as well as new um, processed stuff that was microwavable. Uh, so yeah, obviously as a kid, I didn't have access to a lot of super junky food most of the time, but I did on occasion. As far as home goes, it was kind of special occasions. I mean, they would buy Halloween candy, and when we would go camping or on certain trips, they would buy sodas. But most of the time, we didn't have soda at home. There was a point kind of later on where we started to. My mom found a weekly deal that Domino's Pizza did, um, and kept it going for like 20 years because my mom is good at like haggling with people, and even though we got that deal long past the time it was supposed to be over. But basically, it was like one large pizza and probably 3 or 4 cans of Coke. So we each got like 2 pieces of pizza and 1 can of Coke, and that was it. Um, so even in those instances, when you could say, well, this is not the healthiest food, I didn't have access to enough of it to really like go super overboard on it. And of course, when I had the opportunity to get candy and other things like that from other sources, then I would do that. But for a good portion of my childhood, not only was I eating healthier, uh, but I also, uh, I didn't have, I exercised quite a bit. I had a lot of times where I was riding my bike or walking places and running around and, playing sports and doing all that kind of good stuff. So I was not, although we did have computers and video game systems and stuff some of the time, we weren't allowed to just sit there and play that all the time, especially when I still live with my father. He was insistent on electronic devices not being on for long periods of time, unless, of course, he was using it himself. Then he was exempt from that, obviously. But that I think a lot of people could relate to that with their parents. But whatever's fun for them goes longer. But we did a lot of playing outside and things like that. So without going into a whole lot of detail about all of my childhood activities, which I've done on some other videos and things like that, I just kind of wanted to give you an idea of basically like how my childhood was. Now, it was probably around starting to get into like fifth, sixth grade years where, for whatever reason, I don't know if just what I had access to changed or whether my metabolism just started to change as I started to go through, hit puberty or whatever, whatever the first inklings of that were. Because I had basically operated always under the kind of mentality or the MO, the behavior that it was like whatever food was available to me, I would eat as much of it as was available. And, I didn't have like an overabundance most of the time. It was like, this is the amount of food we have. So yeah, if there was seconds available of something, then I would usually have it. But a lot of times there wasn't. So I wasn't like seriously overeating for a while. But then I started to have more opportunities for whatever reason to eat more at a time, eat more dessert type items, things like that, especially once my parents got divorced and I lived with my mother, because not only I didn't have to share as much food with other people because I, 3 less people in the place. I have 2 brothers and my father wasn't there, except, my brothers would be there some weekends. But although the other time it was just me and my mother, so I didn't have to share as much. And, I would she would get like she'd order and she'd get food in bulk sometimes from places like the Schwann's truck and things like that, that would home deliver food because she didn't have a car, didn't drive, so it was easier for her than having to go to the grocery store every time to have food delivered. Um, and you get like big boxes of like drumsticks or Sunday Crunch bars or things like that. And on a day in the summer when I didn't have to go to school and I was just doing whatever during the day, uh, I could eat eight, of ice cream bars, things like that. Basically, my kind of mentality of eat whatever that you have available to you started to result in a whole lot more calories. And eventually, as my metabolism changed, whatever, I started to get kind of a gut. I remember there was one time my father was describing the difference because both my brothers were pickier eaters than I was. And so there was one time he was talking about, he pointed to each of us at each side of the table and said, from this side of the table, I hear, what's this green stuff? And from over this side, I hear, ew, pieces. And from over here, I hear, which of course was me. And I remember there was this commercial for Special K back then that had this woman proudly announcing, I can't pinch an inch, meaning like an inch of fat on her side. And I remember how proud I was when I could first pinch an inch, and I would show people that. So obviously, my contrarian nature in that instance was probably not a real healthy thing. But anyway, as I continued on through junior high and high school years, my eating habits got even worse, and there were periods of time where, I wasn't even eating a home cooked meal a lot of the time. I was eating stuff out of the snack machines. I had periods of time where I would eat animal crackers and soda for lunch, and then a Snickers bar and soda later in the day for my dinner, basically. So things like that, where I ate pretty terribly. And as I got old enough, and when I first got a job, it was at McDonald's. So I, of course, was eating McDonald's food, and I ate other fast food when I had the money to. And would eat movie theater food and when we go to movies, those kind of things. So, anyway, definitely did not have an attitude of, oh, I've got to make sure I eat for my health, And even though I did start to get a gut, I still overall was in relatively good shape because I still walked and rode my bike everywhere. It wasn't until I was 19 years old and got my first car and got a job at Long John Silver's where the combination of the fried food just about every day, and I was no longer getting the exercise I used to because I was driving places. I gained like 50 pounds, in less than a year. And that was the start. That was when I first went over 200 pounds and stayed that way until last year. It was summer of 2018 when I got under 200 pounds for the first time since, my early adulthood. So yeah, that's a little bit about how I grew up. Pretty typical for some people, not necessarily typical for others. But like a lot of people, it got worse when I had a child and sort of had an excuse to not, exercise because everything was about, I became a single father. So a lot of it was about taking care of my son and taking care of his needs and not really worrying about myself, just sort of existing and surviving however I could. So yeah, not exactly the best habits. And coming up in part 2, I will tell you about when I first tried dieting. I'll basically tell you my history of trying to lose weight or diet in any way at all, because I did try several different things over a many years period. So we'll get into a little bit of that. But I wanted in this first part to just talk about kind of my general childhood stuff growing up. And the time always flies because, I'm long-winded, but I hope that maybe some of my future videos can be shorter, but that's the way it goes. So anyway, join us next time for more about my wonderful eating habits. See ya.